On September 19, 1944, as the Allied armies advanced from the west and the Soviets pressed from the east, Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, signed the orders that would give life to an organization that would carry the weight of Nazism's last bet for survival. His name was Werwolf. The word was not chosen at random. It came directly from Hermann Löns's novel Der Werwolf, an epic romance about 17th-century guerrillas fighting invaders in the Nuremberg wasteland. That novel, published in 1910, had sold more than 800,000 copies by 1945. It was, according to historian Walter Linden, the fundamental book of the German Völkisch movement. Only Mein Kampf surpassed it in sales within the Reich. The man appointed to head this organization was SS Obergruppenführer Hans Adolf Prützmann, a veteran of the terror machine on the Eastern Front. Prützmann had joined the SS in 1930 and rose through the ranks with impressive rapidity. He was already an SS lieutenant general in 1935, the year Himmler personally attended his wedding in East Prussia. He had served as an HSSPF, High Chief of SS and Police in Hamburg, Königsberg, and for 2.5 years in Ukraine and southern Russia, where he accumulated almost unparalleled knowledge of guerrilla warfare, personally oversaw attempts at negotiation with the Ukrainian partisan army, and led the scorched earth withdrawal from Ukraine. He was, from the Nazi perspective, the ideal man to build a post-war guerrilla group. The structure that Prützmann established reflected the architecture of power of the SS. Its headquarters, the so-called Bureau Prützmann, was first set up in Petz, near Berlin, and then moved to Rheinsberg, the period residence of Frederick the Great northwest of the capital. There was no risk that Prützmann would be tied to a base. He was equipped with a private train that his collaborators, with bitter irony, simply called the Train. The immediate staff included SA Brigade Führer Siebel, responsible for training and technical administration, SS Colonel Dalquen, propaganda specialist and former commander of the Waffen-SS propaganda company, and Frau Maisch, which led the female component of the organization. The territory of the Werwolf was organized along the boundaries of the defense districts of the Wehrmacht's home, the Wehrkreise, and within each came under the supervision of the local HSSPF, which in turn were to appoint a Kommissar Werwolf, later renamed Special Abwehr Commander. Prützmann preferred army officers for these local posts. He wanted to build his essentially civilian organization around a solid military core. The Hitler Youth and the SA were to appoint their own regional commissars to maintain contact with the SS movement, although it is doubtful that all these positions were ever filled. The Werwolf's missions, as they were conceived, encompassed a wide variety of actions: sabotage of enemy lines of communication, especially railroads, acts of political and economic sabotage, elimination of collaborators, dissemination of propaganda, infiltration of the offices of the Allied military government, intelligence gathering on enemy supply and transport routes, and encouragement to the population for boycott and passive resistance. The Völkischer Beobachter, the official organ of the NSDAP, went so far as to compare Nazi guerrilla warfare to U-boat attacks on Allied convoys, groups of hunters tracking 3-ton vehicles without escorts. Just as U-boats shot down isolated merchant ships, the werewolf groups received ammunition concealed in secret depots. In at least one documented case, a werewolf assumed the identity of a ranger to guard caches of sabotage material buried in the forests. Various government agencies and the German military conducted detailed studies on the use of natural caves as large warehouses for clandestine supplies. Groups left behind enemy lines were based in hidden underground bunkers called strong points, which served as barracks and command posts. On the North Rhine, approximately 30 of these facilities were excavated by Ruhr miners on loan from the Hibernia Mining Company, supervised by the director of the construction of the Western Wall. The main means of communication with the German lines was wireless radio, although there was also a nebulous plan to connect the galleries by an underground telephone network operated by postal technicians. How many men did the werewolf have? Documents and subsequent statements by Prützmann and Siebel reveal that the number of recruits was always insufficient. Until the last month of the war, the organization's total membership probably never exceeded 5,000 or 6,000 guerrillas. Recruiters resorted to expedients such as the direct conscription of older recruits and the deliberate deception of potential volunteers through vague or outright false descriptions of the activities they would be asked to do, such as penetrating enemy lines in civilian clothes or accepting vials of poison to swallow in the event of imminent capture. Many of the deceived conscripts and volunteers deserted or refused to complete the training. Himmler reacted by threatening deserters with imprisonment in concentration camps. The training of the recruits combined original materials and translations of Soviet guerrilla manuals. In January 1945, a comprehensive manual was printed under the title Werwolf, Winke für Jagdeinheiten. Werwolf, Instructions for Fighter Units. The courses included sabotage, Morse code, wireless transmission, terrain reconnaissance, and assassination techniques. The instructors were mostly veterans of the anti-partisan war on the Eastern Front, officers of the Wehrmacht, the Waffen-SS, and Otto Skorzeny's SS Ranger. Prützmann, in fact, had tried to incorporate Skorzeny as head of the Werwolf. At a meeting of SS security chiefs in November 1944, Himmler offered Skorzeny control of the movement. Prützmann, who was present, lowered his head and shuffled his papers uncomfortably, but Skorzeny politely rejected the proposal, claiming that he already had more work than he could handle. It is evident that Skorzeny saw the Werwolf as an inefficient duplication and superfluous of his own SS Hunters program. However, he would later negotiate agreements with Prützmann for FAK units, front intelligence, to participate in the deployment of Werwolf groups. Not everything in the Werwolf program was mountain guerrilla warfare and bridge sabotage. As operational control of the movement slipped out of Prützmann's hands, the general resorted to more macabre methods. One of the most disturbing was the possibility of mass murder by poison. The idea took concrete shape in October 1944, when a conference on the subject was held in Berlin at the Criminal Technical Institute, KTI, the scientific research center of the SS and the police. Prützmann took an immediate interest in the project, in part because the KTI was already a source of suicide blisters for use by the Werwolves themselves, small capsules that operatives had to swallow if they faced imminent capture. Before long, the entire project of poisoning enemy supplies was transferred to Department 4B of Bureau Prützmann, along with large quantities of poisons. By early 1945, tests had been completed on injecting lethal doses of methanol into alcoholic beverages, the method selected during the October conference as the most effective for poisoning liquor, and tests were continuing on more exotic chemicals. Knowledge of these methods of poisoning was widely disseminated among potential Nazi resistors. Special units were dispatched along the Western and Eastern fronts with the mission of contaminating alcohol and food that was likely to be consumed by Allied and Soviet troops. This was, with obscure probability, the most successful of all the Werwolf programs in terms of casualties caused, and its effects continued well into the post-war period. The Surgeon General of US forces in Europe reported that between February and July 1945, 188 soldiers died from methanol in alcoholic beverages. As late as 1946, 2 US soldiers in Ludwigsburg died from consuming schnapps so loaded with harmful ingredients that authorities deemed their sale an organized form of sabotage. In response, the American command ordered its forces in southern Germany to refrain from using captured German food products, even as they outgrew their supply units. Soviet casualties in Eastern Europe were probably even higher. The Red Army headquarters in Austria issued a warning in the summer of 1945, notifying that many fatal casualties had resulted from the consumption of toxic spirits intentionally left behind by the Nazis. The project didn't stop at food poison. When the Germans discovered, through intelligence means, that Schaeff had authorized the possible in the use of non-lethal gases against Werwolf detachments or German forces that resisted after the cessation of organized resistance, that finding encouraged Nazi Jacobins, such as Goebbels, who were looking for an opportunity to make use of Germany's own reserves of poison gas. In the final weeks of the war, the Ministry of Armaments came under pressure to transfer these substances to Werwolf and other guerrilla groups. Albert Speer told British interrogators after the war that Werwolf officials were sent from his agency to the Wehrmacht's armaments department, which supplied the material. There is no evidence that these stockpiles were ever used by the Werwolf, although advancing Allied forces discovered underground caches of poison gas and other chemical warfare substances, as well as secret pilot plants apparently designed to initiate further production of that material after enemy occupation occurred. The company IG Farben had produced these gas reserves, along with a highly flammable liquid called N-Stoff that burned on contact and emitted toxic fumes. Infrastructure sabotage completed the destructive arsenal. In Berlin's Lichtenberg neighborhood, a Werwolf demolition group showed up at the district water utility facility with a pump, but was kicked out by former employees of unions organized by a local pastor. At Trier, the power station was prepared for destruction by saboteurs who stayed behind, although the explosives were discovered by American troops before they could be detonated. In Krefeld, a suspected Nazi demolition agent was apprehended by the CYC after a fire at the Simpelkamp works. Simpelkamp was the first major weapons producer captured by the Allies, and the fire destroyed several building plans, formulas, and complex pieces of machinery that were the functional heart of the plant. In the Rhineland, the Werwolves blew up an American command post at Mutzenach on March 28, 1945, killing the town's mayor in the process. Several weeks later, they also destroyed a school in Neuss, although this attempt caused no American casualties because the troops using the building as accommodation had abandoned it shortly before the explosion. In Bremen, a mined police station just before the arrival of the British exploded on the morning of June 4, 1945. Killing 5 Americans and 39 Germans, and injuring a much larger number of people. The explosion was especially serious because the initial detonation chained a huge cache of weapons and ammunition stored in the building. On the Eastern Front, a Soviet intelligence report suggested that the Germans had plans to blow up various structures in the Soviet rear 15 to 20 days after they were taken by the Red Army. In March 1945, Werwolf demolition experts from the Berlin KTI were involved in a complex plan to blow up Hermann Göring's ostentatious estate in eastern Germany, Karinhall, under the feet of Soviet soldiers. The plan called for stragglers to blow up the farm into rubble, while Soviet soldiers were forced to flee the farm. They scattered around it in search of luxury and booty. It was abandoned solely because of technical constraints. It was too difficult to hide enough explosives in the basement of the huge mansion. Not content with physical destruction, the dying regime also staged the ruin of the nation's cultural heritage. During March and April 1945, the Gauleiter of Berlin, Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, Thuringia and the Upper Danube were ordered to blow up the deposits of works of art that had been moved to their Gaue to protect them from bombing. In the capital, young Werwolf fans stormed an art repository set up by the Berlin Museum in the Friedrichshain anti-aircraft tower, which was being defended by German forces until the night of May 2nd to 3rd. Treasured in that sanctuary, pieces of the heritage of humanity that had survived the passage of time were detonated by the Reich's own guardians in 2 assaults. The second, in mid-May, destroyed the contents of 3 entire floors of the tower. The National Gallery of the Berlin Museum, its picture gallery, various collections of antiquities and sculptures, and the collections of the Egyptian, Märkisches, arts, and ethnological museums. The losses included 800 pieces of Greek terracotta, 300 ancient vessels, 441 sculptures and 2,800 antique glass objects, in addition to thousands of various works of art. The cost to the Berlin Museum was greater than all the combined damage sustained by enemy bombing or ground warfare. Verbal threats and visual intimidation completed the psychological arsenal. From March 1945, Werwolf fans painted slogans such as "Beware traitor, the werewolf is watching you," and "Whoever abandons the Führer will be hanged as a traitor" on the walls of the cities. The red runes of the werewolf began to appear painted on the doors of potential collaborators. Catholic and Protestant priests became special targets because the regime suspected that they would preach a doctrine of Christian conciliation with the Allies, and because, once the Nazi administration was evacuated or destroyed, the Church would remain the only institution capable of mediating between the victors and the defeated population. "There will be a good field of activity here for our terror groups," Goebbels said of the clergy. Several priests were attacked, and those who were not were warned to maintain a hostile stance toward the murderers of our wives and children. The final paradox was that the regime that had promised the greatest of triumphs ended up turning entirely against its own people. On February 13, 1945, the Ministry of Justice authorized summary courts in enemy-threatened areas of the Reich. Bormann suspended the proceedings of the party courts in favor of summary sentences by competent political leaders, and found this document so essential given the state of mind that he circulated it among his Gauleiter. Then came the extra-legal flag orders that stipulated that whoever raised a white flag would be subject to immediate execution. Nazism, as journalist Sebastian Haffner pointed out, had finally turned on the Germans themselves as their last victim. If the population did not want to participate faithfully in a real people's war, it would be punished in a final burst of destruction. Liberal satirist Erich Kästner captured the horror with a lapidary phrase, "The Ludendorffs lose our wars, while the Erzbergers lose their lives." On Palm Sunday, March 25, 1945, at 11 p.m., a man named Franz Oppenhoff left his neighbor's house in Aachen and walked to his own under a clear sky. He was 42 years old, a lawyer by training, had obtained his degree from the University of Cologne, and from 31 October 1944 he was the Oberbürgermeister, Supreme Mayor, of Aachen, the first German city taken by the Allies. A man who had survived the Gestapo, who had fled to Eupen in Belgium with his wife and daughters in September 1944 to escape persecution, who had been chosen by the Americans precisely because he was not a Nazi. 5 minutes after leaving the party at his neighbor's house, Oppenhoff was dead. 3 assassins were waiting for him on his own doorstep, pretending to be downed German pilots seeking German lines. One of them, SS Unterscharführer Josef Leitgeb, shouted, "Heil Hitler," and put a bullet in his head. The mission had been conceived under the code name Unternehmen Karneval, Operation Carnival, and personally ordered by Heinrich Himmler. It was planned by Prutzmann, who commissioned HSSPF West Karl Gutenberger to assemble a special team. Gutenberger chose as leader a former SS Ranger volunteer, Lieutenant Herbert Wenzel, who recruited his own small team. The final team consisted of 6 people: Wenzel, Austrian Unterscharführer Josef Leitgeb, former Border Patrol agents Karl-Heinz Hennemann and Georg Haidorn as guides in the Aachen area, a 22-year-old girl named Ilse Hirsch from the Hitler Youth Movement, and a 16-year-old named Erich Morgenschweiss, recruited directly from the Werwolf training camp in Hülschrath. Everyone was aware from the outset that the Allies would probably regard Oppenhoff's murder as a war crime. They knew that if they were captured and their mission was discovered, they would be treated like the English-speaking commandos who had donned captured uniforms and parachuted behind Allied lines during the Battle of the Bulge. Those had been summarily tried, tied to poles and shot. None of them backed down. On the night of March 20th, the 6 paratroopers jumped out of a captured B-17 bomber, a Nazi-owned American-made aircraft of the Kampfgeschwader 200, and landed in the woods near Gemmenich in the Belgian-Dutch-German border triangle. While crossing the German border, they killed a Dutch border guard who accidentally appeared. They then set up camp, and Ilse Hirsch, who had separated from the group, went alone to Aachen, where she contacted a friend in the Hitler Women's Youth, the BDM, to discover Oppenhoff's exact whereabouts. On March 25th, Palm Sunday, Wenzel, Leitgeb, and one more approached Oppenhoff's house. They called him from the home of his neighbors under the pretext of needing guidance. Wenzel hesitated. Leitgeb does not. The shot to the head was at point-blank range. A U.S. patrol car checking a phone line previously cut by Wenzel arrived moments after the killers dispersed. Escaping from Aachen, Leitgeb stepped on an anti-personnel mine and was shattered to death. Ilse Hirsch tripped over a wire trap and the explosion tore her knee. He survived. At the subsequent trial, Hennemann and Heidorn received prison sentences. Hirsch was acquitted. Morgenschweiss was 16 years old and not yet chargeable. Wenzel was never found. The effect of Oppenhoff's execution was immediately visible. In Aachen, where it had already been difficult to find Germans willing to accept the position of mayor, the task became practically impossible. Many people who had accepted appointments in other Rhenish cities resigned or simply did not show up for work when they heard about the fate of the Oberbürgermeister of Aachen. In still Nazi-controlled Stuttgart, Oberbürgermeister Strölin himself wrote to the local HSSPF Hoffmann complaining that the move threatened not only collaborators in occupied territories, but also civil servants in still German areas preparing to facilitate the transition. Strölin feared, with good reason, that he was already being watched by werewolf elimination teams. Joseph Goebbels was in charge of amplifying the propaganda terror. On April 1, 1945, an underground station identifying itself as Radio Werewolf went on the air. Goebbels personally transmitted, informing the world that the Germans had a system of secret courts to execute death sentences for vigilantism. Prutzmann, without delay, ordered every loyal Nazi to assassinate all mayors in territories under Allied control. If there was one component of the werewolf that worried the Allies more than any other, it was the Hitler Youth. Since its founding in 1922, the HJ had grown into a mass movement with compulsory membership since before the war. By the mid-1930s, the Army and SS were already providing instructors for HJ exercises and were running special courses with veterans of the Great War. By 1938, more than 1 million boys were enrolled in shooting programs. From 1943 onwards, the HJ provided personnel for anti-aircraft artillery servers, teenagers subjected to enemy fire for the first time, in a legal zone that wondered whether the flak auxiliaries in half uniform were soldiers protected by the Geneva Convention or simply Francs-tireurs. The big step towards guerrilla warfare came in the autumn of 1944. The Chief of Staff of the HJ, Helmut Merkel, proposed in August of that year the training of 100,000 boys for self-defense squads that could fight both defeatist civilians in the interior and enemy guerrillas on the Reich's borders. When the American occupation threatened the Palatinate in February 1945, a strong tendency to assume increasingly dominant attitudes became evident among the leaders of the HJ youth leaders insisted on gaining more influence and important positions, and in some cases took control of the Volkssturm, displacing army officers. In December 1944 or January 1945, a conference of SS and HJ leaders was held in Potsdam, bringing together both Prutzmann and HJ Brigadeführer Kloos from Usingen, Hesse, elected in October 1944 to lead the entire guerrilla program of the Hitler Youth. It was decided that the Kloos staff would be attached to the Bureau Prutzmann and would function as a subordinate arm of the Werwolf. Henceforth, the groups or individuals of the Hitler Youth would be organized under the tactical direction of the SS and police commanders. The code word Werwolf was first applied to the HJ's guerrilla program precisely in those weeks. Recruitment followed a well-defined pattern. Regional offices of the HJ contacted local leaders and instructed them to select between 6 and 12 candidates for werewolf training. Those selected had to be politically reliable and intelligent, and specifically, they should not be prominent members of the organization, in order to go unnoticed. The girls of the BDM were also chosen mainly as radio operators. In the Northern March alone, Friesland/Schleswig-Holstein, there were 20 local chieftains, of whom only 5 were chosen to organize werewolf operations. The most intensive training courses were held at the defense training camps or at other institutions connected with the HJ. 2 boys captured by the Americans described being recruited from an HJ sports instructor school in March 1945, from where they traveled to a werewolf training camp called a BS Roda Rhön, where they were trained in clandestine propaganda and petty sabotage. The special emphasis was placed on tricks such as cutting phone lines and then temporarily resealing the cuts to delay detection. More intensely military courses at an HJ camp in the Palatinate at Woldmoor showed how SS non-commissioned officers taught orientation to 15- and 16-year-old recruits while subjecting them to night combat exercises. At the younger end of the spectrum, one of the first guerrilla operatives captured in eastern Belgium during the height of the Ardennes offensive was a 12-year-old boy. He described receiving instructions from a retiring SS sergeant in September 1944, who ordered him to collect weapons and commit sabotage. Several teams of the HJ in Alsace exchanged road signs. They cut wires and scattered tacks on the main road to Saverne. The Americans considered these groups a security threat of considerable proportions. Once American forces penetrated deep into the Rhine, HJ werewolf numbers behind Allied lines climbed from dozens to hundreds. In 24 documented hours of February 23, 1945, 2 HJ scouts were apprehended attempting to spy on troop movements on the Gangelt-Geilenkirchen road. 2 others were arrested by the 104th Infantry Division. 10 HJ line crossers were caught by the 7th Armoured Division. 5 BDM radio agents were captured by the CIC in Krefeld. 15 HJ guerrillas were detained near Bonn between March 18th and 22nd, all equipped with sabotage kits. The pattern was unmistakable. To the US military, these actions were not teenage antics. They were deliberate intelligence and sabotage operations carried out by miners who had been taught from the cradle to die by the Führer. An agent of the American Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, noted in his report that only teenagers had the fanaticism and persistent belief in victory necessary to throw themselves into the werewolf work. Among all the post-capitulation survival plans that the Nazi hierarchy hatched in the last months of the Reich, none was as meticulously prepared, nor as disturbing in its implications, as that of Reichsjugendführer Arthur Axmann. Axmann was born on February 18, 1913 in Hagen, Westphalia. He founded the first Hitler Youth Group in that region in 1928, was recalled to Berlin in 1932 as Nazi regional chief, and in August 1940 was appointed Reichsjugendführer, supreme commander of the HJ throughout the Reich, succeeding Baldur von Schirach. He was seriously wounded on the Eastern Front in 1941, losing his right arm to the 23rd Infantry Division. He personally proposed to Himmler the creation of what would become the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, and Hitler approved it. He was among the last present at the Führer bunker on the 30th of April 1945. He testified to seeing the corpses of Martin Bormann and SS Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger near the railway shunting ground of the Stettiner Bahnhof while escaping from Berlin surrounded by the Red Army. The Axmann Plan, as it was later called by Allied researchers, took shape in March and April 1945. As a preliminary step, the headquarters of the Reich Youth Leadership was moved from Berlin to the headquarters of an elite HJ school in Bad Tölz in the Bavarian Alps. The plans envisaged moving 35,000 HJ leaders to the inaccessible highlands of southern Germany and Bohemia, from where they could maintain cohesion and harass the occupying forces. Axmann anticipated an imminent war between the Western powers and the Soviet Union, so for him the trick of survival was to hold together until the HJ could join the Western Allies in a final campaign against the hordes of the East. Messengers were dispatched to the 4 cardinal points of the Reich: Erich Schröder to the north, Ernst Overbeck to the west, Hans Winter to the southeast, Gottfried Griesmeier to Austria and Bohemia. They carried orders for local HJ leaders to retreat south. They were told that they did not need to show up with weapons and equipment, as they would be provided with half a year's supply by the Wehrmacht. If evacuation proved impossible, the organizers had to camouflage themselves and wait for the development of a favorable climate for clandestine work. Griesmeier followed this plan in Bohemia. He sent armed boys from the HJ into the woods and personally took charge of their spiritual education. On May 5, 1945, He and other SS and HJ leaders met in the town of Prachatitz, where they founded a rejuvenated NSDAP based on a new 10-point program. The true genius aspect of the Axmann Plan was its provision for a continuous, self-renewing source of funds for the Wehrwolf activity. Axmann appointed his chief deputy, H.J. General Major Franke of Dresden, as leader of the political military wing of the Wehrwolf Alpino. Franke received 50,000 marks to establish himself by opening a children's literature publishing house. With that money, he finally settled in Marburg. More importantly, Axmann also transferred a much larger sum to the financial head of the movement, an HJ official named Heidemann, who settled in Bad Tölz. In the last days before the capitulation, the Reich cashier gave an additional 10 million marks to an HJ official named Dreblow, who passed much of that money to Heidemann. With this capital, Heidemann made a sound investment at the end of April 1945. He bought Tessmann & Sons, a transport company with offices throughout Germany. Tessmann became the base of Heidemann's operations, as its nature as a transport company improved the Wehrwolf's communications, and its food and coal operations gave it direct contact with the American military government, particularly with General Patton's Lax GML in Bavaria. Heidemann proved to be a skilled businessman. By the end of 1945, he had bought 6 additional companies and expanded operations throughout the American and British areas, and even into Austria. An extensive network of contacts was built with some of the biggest names in the German business world, including the Krupp family, who used their influence to facilitate Heidemann's expansion into the Ruhr. At the same time, in the British zone, the head of the HJ Personnel Bureau, Willy Lohel, who had been stranded in Oldenburg at the end of the war, began to reorganize spontaneously. By July 1945, Lohel felt it was time to act, and he met with Lieutenant Generals Kurt Bedaus and Ernst Overbeck to preside over the gradual consolidation of a movement of like-minded HJ leaders. They called it the Society of the Righteous. Its economic wing, unlike its parallel in the American zone, was underdeveloped. Lacking the last-minute injections of party funds that would have allowed a company to be bought, Lohel and his companions wasted time with amateur plans to sustain subversive activity through beekeeping, the sale of handicrafts, and the direction of a traveling puppet show. Gustav Memminger, leader of the Rhenish HJ Werwolf, was appointed liaison between the northern and southern movements. In November 1945, Axmann visited the British zone in person, meeting with Overbeck, Memminger, Winter and other HJ leaders in Lübeck. In the summary of the conspiracy program that Memminger wrote and that was found among his belongings after his eventual arrest, the text stated, "Preservation of the national substance. Germany as it existed in 1933 without imperialist objectives. The German genius is the last barrier against Bolshevism. The last 12 years were not in vain, as many principles and achievements of the National Socialists have been incorporated into the parties now in existence." Allied counterintelligence agencies were quick to react. As early as June 1945, the CIC had suspicions about the Tessmann Company, and several undercover agents were sent to infiltrate the company. By the autumn, these agents had grasped the full significance of the Heidemann conglomerate. The British had also begun infiltration efforts into the underground HJ movement in their area, particularly by tacking one of its leaders, Günther Ebeling. By the end of 1945, the Allies had obtained lists of members and sympathizers, a compilation of 1,000 names associated with the Southern Group and 1,500 with the Northerner. On that basis, a joint Anglo-American counterinsurgency mission was executed in the first post-war winter. Codenamed Operation Nursery, a series of raids in 1945 to 1946 captured almost the entire leadership of the HJ Werwolf. Axmann and his main liaison agents, Memminger and Overbeck, were arrested in December 1945, as was one of Heidemann's main business associates. After the first round of interrogations, an American patrol was also sent to the Alps to storm a cabin where HJ conspirators met frequently and where they had stored a cache of ammunition. After a 4-hour climb through a blinding snowstorm, the cabin was found almost buried in snow, and 2 HJ guerrillas were captured. On January 7, 1946, Heidemann and his top aides were arrested. 565,000 marks were found in Heidemann's room, still wrapped in Reichsbank wrappers. Axmann was tried at a denazification court in Nuremberg in May 1949 and sentenced to 3 years and 3 months in prison as a principal offender. In August 1958, a West Berlin court imposed an additional fine of 35,000 marks. After his release, Axmann worked as a sales representative in Gelsenkirchen and later in Berlin. He died on October 24, 1996, at the age of 83, in Berlin, as the last survivor of Reichsführer rank within the central apparatus of the NSDAP. The werewolf was not a uniform experience throughout Germany. Certain regions became hotbeds of particularly intense activity, and their stories reveal both the possibilities and the limits of movement. In the Harz, the mountain range of central Germany, guerrilla activity persisted for several months after the region was occupied. A hotel and radio tower on Mount Brocken were destroyed in a guerrilla attack on April 30, 1945. In the Thuringian Forest, another traditional Nazi stronghold, werewolf cells operated well into the post-war period. Soviet and Polish communist police archives reported that werewolves remained active throughout 1945 and 1946 in East Germany and in the territories annexed by Poland. Radio interception showed that approximately 200 werewolves remained behind the Soviet front in East Prussia after the end of the war, and, according to eyewitness testimony, German partisans in the forests of East Pomerania managed to rescue German civilians from deportation to the USSR. In Silesia, the German ethnic peninsula in the east, the werewolf proved more active than anywhere else on the Eastern Front. East of Nightkoper, members of a 10-man werewolf group were completely surrounded by a Soviet NKVD patrol, but still attempted to shoot their way through, losing 7 of their members in the process. In eastern Austria, a werewolf detachment reconnoitering a Soviet armored column near Bruck an der Leitha was located by the enemy. The Soviet response was to locate the spies in their trenches and then to drive over the depressions with the tracks of their tanks. At the southern end, the Alps provided the natural refuge that planners had dreamed of. HJ groups that had been directed south found training huts near Benediktbeuern that were maintained by HJ and SS personnel for months after the capitulation. Sergeant Reutemann was enthusiastically preparing plans to attack local civilians who cooperated with the Americans. Ranger Hoffner kept cabin occupants updated on events in the populated valleys. These facilities were abandoned only in July 1945, when the Americans launched raids in the surrounding mountains. The story of 18-year-old Walter Kuhn, captured by the CIC on July 2, 1945 as he emerged from the hills, illustrates the full spectrum of the experience. He had been selected to lead one of the HJ groups in the Alpine Mountains. Ironically, when he was captured, Kuhn was wearing a sweater in the colors of his old high school in New York. He was the son of Fritz Kuhn, the former leader of the American Bund of Nazi sympathizers in the United States. The number of HJ fighters who actually reached the southern mountains remains unknown. But the HJ Chief of Upper Bavaria, the HJ General Major Panzer, had rather unrealistic illusions about the effect of partisan activities against the advancing Allies, according to an Allied counterintelligence report from the period. In the Black Forest in southwestern Germany, werewolf groups maintained an active presence during the autumn of 1945. Near the Swiss border at Singen, 24 werewolf partisans were denounced by their own countrymen and quickly locked up by the French. This collaboration of the civilian population with the occupying forces to expose the werewolf was one of the factors that contributed most to the failure of the movement. The Soviet consequences for communities suspected of hosting werewolf were brutal. In the village of Kup, where a member of the HJ killed a Soviet officer who had raped a German girl, the Red Army responded by setting the village on fire. A Vatican report from the period described that Russian reprisals to certain reactions of the werewolf were terrible. Using flamethrowers, the Russians destroyed entire villages. In the Sudeten district of Troppau/Opava, the Czechs executed all Germans, men and women, in a village suspected of providing support werewolf, an episode that became one of the most extreme of the post-war violence in that region. Historian Perry Biddiscombe, whose research in archives in 4 countries produced the definitive work on the movement, estimated that the total number of deaths directly caused by werewolf activity was probably between 3,000 and 5,500 people, including those killed in reprisals and anti-partisan operations. A figure that, in the context of the war, represents a drop in the bloodstream of the conflict, but which is significant if considered in its own terms as an example of post-war terrorism and guerrilla warfare in Europe. 6 main factors contributed to the widespread disillusionment with the werewolf war. First, the entire program rested on a flawed premise, at least in the German West. The Allies were the only force standing between the German population and the Soviet occupation. Attacking the Western occupiers was precisely the opposite of what most Germans wanted. Second, the party's top officials shamefully fled in the face of the Allied advance, depriving the movement of the credibility it would have needed to generate popular support. Third, Germany's defeat was far more complete than that of countries like France or Yugoslavia, where partisans had foreign sources of supply and a justified hope of eventual victory. Fourth, the German population, exhausted by years of bombing, starvation, and unprecedented suffering, was too annihilated to embark on new, violent adventures. "The war-weary population," said one German general, "will prove to be a poor terrain for guerrilla activities of any kind beyond those of an irresponsible and sporadic nature." Fifth, the terror of enemy reprisals against those who harbored resistance created powerful disincentives. Knowledge of the ruthless manner in which their own armies had always treated saboteurs and francs-tireurs in the occupied territories shaped German expectations of what they could expect. Sixth, and most fundamental, most Germans, by the spring of 1945, did not believe in the cause. The Nazi regime had been isolated and out of touch with the reality of its own people since 1944. Prutzmann was captured by the Allies in the final days of the war. In his custody, he committed suicide with a cyanide capsule. Gudrun Margarete Elfriede Emma Anna Himmler was born on August 8, 1929 in Munich, the only legitimate child of Heinrich Himmler and his wife Margarete. Her father called her Püppi, little doll, and he adored her completely. The girl learned military strategies on her knees, accompanied him on inspection visits to concentration camps, and grew up convinced that her father was an extraordinarily valuable man for Germany. When British forces arrested Himmler on May 20, 1945, and he committed suicide 3 days later with a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth, Gudrun reportedly suffered a nervous breakdown. But it was not the collapse that might be expected. It was not the collapse of someone who discovers that his father was a mass murderer. It was the collapse of those who lose their hero. Until the end of her life, Gudrun Himmler would maintain that the British had murdered her father while he was in their custody. Gudrun and her mother were arrested and forced to testify at the Nuremberg trials. In the post-war period, she worked as a seamstress and secretary, but her surname was a slab. He lost jobs as soon as his identity was discovered. A store owner suggested that she get married to acquire a new surname. "I refuse to live my life as a lie," he replied in 1961 to the Boston Globe. He refused for years to change his name. When she finally married, she married Wolf Dieter Burwitz, a journalist who would become an officer of the far-right National Democratic Party of Germany, NPD. They had 2 children. Between 1961 and 1963, Gudrun worked under an assumed name as a secretary at the headquarters of the Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, West Germany's foreign intelligence service in Pullach, south of Munich. She was fired in 1963 when authorities discovered her true identity. Gudrun's second career was in the shadows of post-war organized neo-Nazism. He became a central figure in the Stille Hilfe, an organization formed after the war to help former SS officers and other Nazi fugitives escape justice and provide financial assistance to their families. La Stille Hilfe assisted Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, head of the Lyon Gestapo responsible for hundreds of deaths, torture and deportations. He also assisted Martin Sommer, known as the Executioner of Buchenwald. Gudrun was one of the most active figures on these networks. He denied the Holocaust until the end of his days. He died on May 24, 2018 in Munich at the age of 88. If Gudrun Himmler represented filial loyalty turned into an instrument of ideological perpetuation, Edda Goering represented something perhaps more disturbing in her innocence: the absolute inability to transcend family mythology. Edda Goering was born in 1938, the only child of Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering and his second wife, actress Emmy Sonnemann. Hermann Goering gave him in 1937 a private yacht called Karin II, named in honor of his deceased first wife, which became a symbol of the inordinate wealth that the second man in the Reich had accumulated. Edda's childhood was extraordinarily opulent. She lived in Karinhal, the family estate full of looted art from occupied Europe, with exotic animals, impeccable gardens, and a paternal attention that Nazi propaganda elevated to the status of a national myth. With the end of the war, Edda's world literally collapsed. They fled the estate before the Russian advance. Goering was arrested and committed suicide in his Nuremberg cell on the night of October 15, 1946, with a cyanide capsule a few hours before he was to be hanged. Edda and her mother lived in poverty, under the public eye and social marginalization. The psychological consequences of this fall took a peculiar direction in Edda. Instead of confronting the reality of what his father had been, he developed an absolute devotion to his memory. At a party held aboard the Karin II in the 1970s, already in the hands of new owners but still a recognizable symbol, Edda was pointed out as a nostalgic relic of the Reich by those present who marveled at her fidelity to her father's memory. Edda maintained for decades that his father had no involvement in Nazi atrocities, that it was fundamentally misunderstood, and that the Nuremberg trial was a pantomime of justice engineered by the victors. In his adult life, he pursued the recovery of property confiscated from his family, legal battles that reflected his refusal to accept the legitimacy of post-war accountability mechanisms. He died in 2019 without having modified these positions. X. Nicholas Frank, the son who refused to be forgotten. The story of Nicholas Frank represents the polar opposite of that of Gudrun Himmler and Edda Goering. He was the fifth son of Hans Frank, Governor-General of occupied Poland, a man who oversaw the extermination of millions of Jews and whose surname was inextricably linked to the horror of Wawel Castle in Krakow, the luxurious residence of the Frank family, while a few kilometers away the mechanisms of annihilation were operating. Niklas was 4 years old when his mother, Brigitte Frank, took him to shop in the Jewish ghetto in Krakow. He remembers the hateful looks of the ghetto children, his confusion at the conditions of misery that surrounded the strange walk, the indifference of his mother. Hans Frank was captured, tried at Nuremberg, and hanged on October 16, 1946. In the post-war period, the Frank children faced universal stigmatization. Niklas took a path that his brothers did not, that of direct and merciless confrontation with his father's legacy. He became a journalist and writer, and in 1987 he published Der Vater, The Father, a devastating denunciation of Hans Frank that shook German public opinion with the violence of his trials. In that work, Nicholas Frank addressed his dead father with a contempt that did not admit of nuance. For Nicholas, Hans Frank was not a man trapped by historical circumstances. He was an active criminal and a coward who justified his crimes to the end under the guise of religious conversion. The book was controversial precisely because it broke the taboo of filial piety in the context of incomprehensible crimes. Nicholas's brother, Norman Frank, took a different path, a permanent ambivalence that oscillated between denial and partial recognition, unable to reach the ultimate condemnation that Nicholas considered the only morally honest response. On April 14, 1930, a boy was born in Obersalzberg in the Bavarian Alps, whom his parents named Martin Adolf Bormann. The first name was that of his father, Martin Bormann, the Führer's secretary and probably the most powerful man in the Reich after Hitler. The second name, Adolf, was given in homage to Hitler himself, his nominal godfather. The boy grew up in absolute privilege, surrounded by the vertigo of Nazi power at its best, and was raised in the violent contempt for religion that characterized his father. With the collapse of the Reich, Martin Adolf Bormann Jr. faced a devastating identity crisis. His father disappeared in the final days of the war. Bormann Sr.'s remains would not be definitively identified until DNA analysis in 1998 confirmed that he had died near the Weidendammer Bridge in Berlin on the night of May 1st to 2nd, 1945. The young Bormann adopted the alias Bergmann to survive. He found refuge in a Christian family, which triggered a spiritual transformation that he himself would describe as radical. He converted to Catholicism and was ordained a priest. As a priest, Martin Adolf Bormann Jr. taught African missions and was active in dialogues aimed at confronting the silence around the Holocaust and the legacy of Nazi perpetrators. He died on March 11, 2013, closing a life marked by the struggle for identity and reconciliation with a past defined by violence and oppression. His story was perhaps the most unlikely personal transformation recorded in the Nazi post-war archives. From the Reich's crown prince to the priest who taught reconciliation. Brigitte Höss, daughter of Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Höss, was around 7 years old when she ran to her mother to show her strawberries she had found in the garden. He did not know that the soil stained by the fruit was ash from the crematorium of the extermination camp that operated a few hundred meters from his house. Rudolf Höss's children grew up in one of the most extreme paradoxes in the history of the 20th century, a domestic life of apparent normality, well-kept garden, animals, school, family affection. A few meters from the largest industrial complex of annihilation that the world has ever known. The family lived in a 4-story villa built especially for them next to the perimeter of the camp. The servants were prisoners. The objects stolen from the victims decorated the house. Höss was arrested by the British on March 11, 1946, tried in Poland, and hanged in front of the crematorium facility at Auschwitz on April 16, 1947, their children scattered. The stigmatization was immediate and profound. Brigitte Höss eventually emigrated to the United States, where she tried for decades to construct an identity separate from the name she bore on her documents. In 2013, director Vanessa Lapa made the documentary Der Anständige, The Decent, based on recently discovered letters and private diaries from Heinrich Himmler. In that same context of documentary review of the period, historian Katrin Himmler, a great-niece of Heinrich Himmler, published in 2014, Himmler Privat, Briefe eines Massenmörders, with historian Michael Wild, which included letters from Himmler to his wife Margarete between 1927 and 1945, along with letters and diaries from Margarete and the young Gudrun. The book showed with direct evidence how Himmler reconciled his functions as architect of extermination with his role as a tender and attentive father. In July 2011, a collection of handwritten diaries by Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death of Auschwitz, responsible for medical experiments on prisoners and selection for gas chambers, was sold at auction by $245,000. The price was paid by the son of a Holocaust survivor, an ultra-Orthodox Jew, with the intention of publishing them to counter denialism and advocate against discrimination. The 3,380 pages of writings spanned the period from 1960 to 1975 and included autobiographical anecdotes, sketches, poems, and disturbing ideological musings on eugenics, overpopulation, and racial mixing. Rolf Mengele, Josef's son, grew up in post-war Germany without knowing his father's real identity. The family hid the truth from him. He was raised with the story that his father was a respectable doctor killed during the war. When he finally discovered the truth as an adult, the impact was devastating in a different sense than might be expected. It produced not a clean rupture, but an endless struggle between residual filial affection and moral horror. Rolf traveled to South America to meet his father. Joseph Mengele was then living in Paraguay and Brazil under false names, avoiding capture since 1949, despite being one of the most wanted Nazi war criminals in the world. The match was tense. Mengele Sr. remained unapologetically unrepentant, denying responsibility for the atrocities at Auschwitz, insisting that he had never caused deliberate harm. Rolf rejected these justifications but did not denounce it. Joseph Mengele died on February 7, 1979 in Bertioga, Brazil, drowning after suffering a stroke while swimming in the sea. His death went unnoticed for years. Rolf knew of her but chose not to reveal his father's identity. She adopted a different name and built a new life, seeking to free her own children from the stigma of the Mengele surname. But the shadow did not dissipate easily. Years later, Rolf would visit Israel and the Yad Vashem Memorial in a gesture of acknowledgement of his father's crimes that did not amount to an acquittal, but represented the only form of honesty that the situation allowed. The silence that covered Nazi crimes in post-war Germany was not a spontaneous phenomenon. It was, in part, a collective survival mechanism, as historian Harold Yerner points out in his analysis of the period 1945 to 1955, the starvation winters of 1946 and 1947, the daily struggle for subsistence under anarchic conditions, the enormity of human displacement, 9 million evacuated and bombed, 14 million refugees and exiles, 10 million forced laborers released homeless, left little mental space for the moral prosecution of crimes committed in the name of all Germans. Many Germans who had not been persecuted by the Nazi regime saw themselves as victims as well. The bleaker the genuinely terrible winters of famine painted, the less the moral distance that separated them from the real victims seemed. In the corporate offices, courts and offices of the Federal Republic, a large part of the Nazi elite continued quietly in their posts. The philosopher Karl Jaspers was one of the very few who publicly addressed the issue of collective crime in the months immediately following the capitulation. The Auschwitz trials of 1963 represented the first real jolt of this institutionalized amnesia. For many Germans, it was then that the confrontation with what had happened in their name really began. From the perspective of the younger generation, the one that became active during the student protests of 1968, the Germans had brought extreme dishonor to themselves by postponing trials. Beate Klarsfeld embodied that generational shift in emblematic ways. In November 1968, at the Christian Democratic Union Convention in West Berlin, Klarsfeld, then 29, approached Federal Chancellor Kurt Georg Kiesinger and slapped him in the face in front of the cameras, shouting, "Nazi." Kiesinger had been a member of the NSDAP since 1933 and had worked in the Foreign Office during the war. The slap became a powerful symbol, the demand for responsibility that could no longer be postponed. The generation that would be born around 1950 and become active in 1968 would feel that no connection bound them to the war, that they owed no debt to the shame of their parents, and that they were in a position to demand an accountability that previous generations had consistently avoided. This claim was eloquent and transformative, though it was not without its own rigidity. The image that that generation projected about the German 50s as a period of suffocating beatitude and universal denial has been colored by later historical research, revealing a more open intellectual life, a more active critique, and a more contradictory daily life than the 1968 myth was willing to acknowledge. The question that remains when examining the whole of the werewolf movement, its plans, its operations, its men and women, its child soldiers, and its ideologues, is why it failed so absolutely. The answer is manifold and says as much about Nazism as it does about the German people as a whole. The most obvious organizational problem was the absence of strong leadership. Kreutzmann was smart and experienced, but operating his organization from a perpetually moving private train was not the most efficient way to build an underground network. The fierce fighting between rival agencies, the army taking werewolf groups for tactical or reconnaissance missions, Bormann expanding it as a domestic terror force, Goebbels establishing a propaganda channel that launched appeals to arms aimed primarily at teenagers, fragmented the organization to the point of becoming incoherent. Perhaps more fundamentally, Kreutzmann was trapped in the Clausewitzian conceptual framework that guerrilla warfare is strictly an adjunct to regular military operations. The werewolf was originally conceived only as an instrument of outreach, that is, of penetration into the occupied territories, not as a vehicle for political succession or even the survival of the system. Only in the last desperate minutes was guerrilla warfare given consideration as a post-capitulation tactic of a revolutionary type, and even these improvised last-minute preparations lacked the necessary depth and coherence. Most telling, however, was the widespread rejection of the German population. American surveys of German teenagers in July 1945 revealed that, although there was a persistent subconscious attachment to certain National Socialist values, the majority of teenagers were pro-American and wanted the adoption of some form of semi-authoritarian democracy in Germany. Three-quarters of these young people rejected their former HJ leaders and suggested that such bosses be barred from holding leadership positions in the new youth movements. On the Rhine, a cook from the Hibernia Company voluntarily led agents of the American CIC to several of the underground galleries excavated by the company. German civilians sometimes led the occupying troops directly to the werewolf supply depots. In the village of Singen, a dozen or so werewolf partisans were betrayed by their own fellow citizens. In short, the werewolf revealed a regime that, by 1944, was isolated and out of touch with the social reality of Germany. The idea of a last Nazi People's War was a fantasy that contradicted all available data on the real mood of the population. Support for the regime had eroded dramatically since the golden years of the mid-1930s. Although Germans were too physically and morally exhausted to turn against the regime, they were also too disillusioned with notions of glory to burn down their homes, sniff the enemy, or bravely enlist in the ranks of mass militia. The war-weary population will prove to be a poor terrain for guerrilla activities of any kind, one German general had said honestly. The Joint Intelligence Committee of the Chef, in its assessment of April 11, 1945, confirmed that all reports from Allied-occupied Germany state that, while there may be bitterness and resentment at the attitude of the Allied troops and the Allied bombings, the mass of the population is apathetic and desperately exhausted from war. The werewolf was the penultimate act of bureaucratic anarchy that resulted in a black night of illegality and self-destruction of the Third Reich. It was also, in Bidiscombe's words, a revelation of the true nature of the Nazi regime, not a monolithic totalitarian state, but a feudal polycratic state of rival bureaucratic principalities, each generally in conflict with the others. On May 24, 2018, Gudrun Berwitz-Himmler died in Munich. To the end, he denied the Holocaust. He never renounced Nazi ideology. She was the last high-profile figure to connect the horror story of the SS to contemporary Germany through direct filiation, a daughter who never ceased to be her father's daughter. Edda Goering died in 2019. Josef Mengele was never tried. Rolf Mengele lives under another name, somewhere in Germany. Martin Adolf Bormann Jr. died in 2013, having traveled the most unlikely journey of the century, from the adored son of the Führer's secretary to the priest who taught reconciliation in African missions. Nicholas Frank, in his 80s, continues to write and speak, reaffirming his condemnation of his father every time someone asks him, reminding us that the path of denunciation is the only one that deserves to be called honest. The Spear sons began careers of their own under the unbearable weight of the Devil's Architect surname. Albert Speer Jr. became an internationally renowned architect and urban planner whose work was deliberately distinguishable from his father's in both style and philosophy. While Speer Sr. used the monumental stone to glorify power, Speer Jr. designed cities for the happiness of the people. The sons of Hers were scattered throughout the world, some under different names. The question underlying all of these stories is the one that journalist and writer Tanya Krasniansky asked in her book Children of Nazis. How do you negotiate identity when your family's crime is not a personal shame but a historical crime of civilizational magnitude? The answers that the sons of the Nazi hierarchs gave to that question cover the entire possible human spectrum. From the total denial and active complicity of Gudrun Himmler to the desperate search for atonement of Martin Bormann Jr. through the brutal confrontation of Niklas Frank and the calculated silence of Rolf Mengele. None of these answers is simple, and none of them solves the underlying problem. But together they form the most complex and disturbing portrait of what happens when monstrosity is also inexorably your father. Berlin, 1945. On a city that had generated 55 million cubic meters of rubble, enough, engineers calculated, to build a mountain of 4,000 meters crowned with perpetual snow on the party field in Nuremberg, an entire generation began to wonder what exactly had happened and what to do with knowledge. The term Stunde Null, 0 hour, that the Germans coined for the end of the war implied a start from nothing, a blank slate. It was a necessary illusion but also a dangerous fiction, because, as the Eiling case illustrated, the waiter from Hesse, who was still in prison in 1949 under Nazi laws that no one had reviewed, in a cell where Himmler's regime survived beyond the creation of the Federal Republic, history does not accept the metaphor of the clean slate. The archives kept his memory, surnames weighed, the networks survived, businesses thrived under new names. The werewolf ultimately failed, not because the Allies were invincible, but because the Germans themselves did not want the war that their leaders tried to impose on them as their final destination. Civilians guided American soldiers to hidden supply depots. The mine workers confronted the SS demolition crews with their own bodies. The mayors have just appointed refused to stop working. The German people, exhausted, hungry, in the rubble, massively chose to live rather than die for a cause they no longer believed to be theirs. But the monster's children were more complicated. For them, there was no simple alternative between loyalty and rejection. They had genuinely loved their parents before they knew who those parents were. And some of them, Gudrun Himmler, Edda Goering, chose to continue loving them even after knowing everything. That love was probably the only victory that the Millennial Reich won in its defeat.